The tribunal room was suffocating, not because of its size, but because of the weight it carried. A space meant for justice had turned into a chamber of humiliation. She stood in the center, flanked by guards who didn't meet her eyes, surrounded by officers who already had their verdict. The air was tense with judgment, not curiosity. Her posture remained firm, spine straight, chin lifted, but even steel has a melting point. And theirs was getting dangerously close. A row of sharply dressed officials sat behind the long mahogany table, faces unreadable, metals glinting under the harsh ceiling light. The one in the center adjusted his collar before clearing his throat. He called her by her name, not her rank. That was intentional. She noticed. Everyone did. Stripping a title verbally before attempting to do so physically, that was always the first step. You've worn this uniform under false pretenses. The officer began, his voice cold, almost rehearsed. There are discrepancies in your service record. Missions we can't verify. Accolades we can't trace. You don't belong in that uniform. The words hit harder than any bullet. Not because she was surprised they had been circling her for weeks, pulling threads, trying to find something that would unravel her. But because the accusations weren't based on truth. They were based on threat. She was too good, too quiet, too deadly. And that made the old guard uncomfortable. Someone in the back of the room scoffed. A young lieutenant whispered something to the man beside him, both failing to suppress a grin. She saw it, filed it away. This wasn't just about her file. It was about perception. And perception, once poisoned, spreads like wildfire. Even if you outrank it. The officer in charge leaned forward, voice tightening. Until a formal inquiry concludes otherwise, we are ordering you to remove your uniform. Here. Now. A murmur ran through the room. Not because of the order, it wasn't unheard of, but because of how public it was. The humiliation was part of the punishment. This wasn't a private reprimand. It was a message to others. Don't climb too fast. Don't shine too bright. Don't be different. Her eyes didn't flinch. She didn't protest. That silence, too, made them uncomfortable. They were prepared for outrage, not composure. She simply reached for her lapel, slowly unfastening the buttons of her service jacket. Each movement deliberate, mechanical, without hesitation. Not because she accepted the charge, but because she had nothing to prove to people who refused to see. The silence in the room deepened with each undone button. Those who once laughed now watched intently, some with smug anticipation, others with uneasy curiosity. Her undershirt clung to her skin as she slid the jacket off her shoulders. It fell to the floor with a soft thud that somehow echoed louder than any shout. Her dog tag swayed gently with the motion, catching the light. She turned, as instructed, to face the tribunal fully. That's when it happened. A sharp inhale cut through the room, not from her, but from someone who recognized what the others didn't. Her shirt had shifted just enough to reveal the edge of something inked across her upper back. It wasn't elaborate, not decorative or flamboyant. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. But one man did. The base commander, until then silent and still like a statue, leaned forward suddenly. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in disbelief. For a split second, his composure cracked. No one noticed except her. That 1 second told her everything she needed to know. He recognized the tattoo. Not as a symbol, but as a code. One that never appeared in open records. One that was only given under extreme circumstances most of these men didn't even know existed. She didn't react. She didn't turn around. But she felt the weight shift in the room. The power dynamic was changing, not through force, but revelation. The tribunal had been certain they were stripping a fraud. But now uncertainty bled through the silence. She had been accused of forging identity, falsifying honor. But that ink said otherwise. That ink said she belonged to something far above their understanding. Something that didn't need their validation. She stood there, arms loose by her sides, the uniform at her feet, the tattoo half revealed like a whispered truth too dangerous to speak aloud. The murmur didn't die, it evolved. From stiff discomfort to hushed speculation, from amusement to tension so thick it pressed down on the room like a storm cloud. The tribunal had spoken, the order had been given, and now all eyes were on her. But beyond the official voices and cold commands, the atmosphere was alive with whispers. Tiny betrayals murmured between cadets who once saluted her. Jokes traded behind pressed palms. Doubt, like a virus, had already infected the ranks. She could feel their eyes. Not on her face, but on the jacket she had just removed, as if the absence of her uniform confirmed everything they needed to believe. It didn't matter how many late nights she spent on recon runs no one else volunteered for. It didn't matter how many combat simulations she had aced while others fumbled. It didn't matter that, when the base lost power last winter, it was her protocol that kept everyone breathing. One accusation and she was just a shadow in boots too big for her. Some of the cadets watching from the back had trained with her, ate beside her in silence, laughed nervously the first time she showed them how to disassemble a rifle blindfolded. She had thought for a moment that maybe they saw her, not just the uniform. But the moment the tribunal raised its voice against her, most of them looked away. That was the true sting. Not the accusations, not the humiliation, but the way people vanished without leaving the room. A second-row sergeant nudged his companion and leaned in just barely loud enough for her to hear. Told you she was too clean. Nobody gets through blackout training on their first try. Unless they had help. The other man chuckled, not with confidence, but the kind of forced laughter people use when they're scared they might be wrong. Her back remained straight, but her fists, hidden in the folds of her pants, curled just slightly. It wasn't rage. It wasn't ego. It was restraint. Because if she let even one flicker of reaction show, they would call it defiance. Emotional instability. Weakness. They were waiting for it. Hoping for it. That's what whisper campaigns do, they lay bait. You either bite or bleed quietly. To them, she was too many things that didn't add up. Too quiet. Too disciplined. Too effective. It threatened the natural hierarchy. She hadn't stumbled up the ranks. She moved like someone who didn't need approval. And in an institution where identity was built around struggle and survival, her lack of visible wounds made her suspect. They hadn't seen the wounds that didn't scar the skin. Like losing an entire unit overseas and having the mission sealed. Like not being able to attend the funerals of teammates because the mission wasn't supposed to exist. Like being forced to scrub your own name from the reports you wrote. She had carried those ghosts in silence. Carried them through the same drills and inspections these cadets complained about. Carried them while they whispered. One junior officer spoke up, his voice a little too loud, his posture trying too hard. If she lied about her record, what else is fake? Her combat citations? Her clearance? Even her deployments? You know they only gave her the transfer because he didn't finish the sentence. Maybe he thought better of it. Or maybe it was the look from the command sergeant seated 2 rows down, the one who had once served in a unit with a similar emblem long before she ever showed up. The sergeant said nothing. But his narrowed eyes said he was piecing something together that others weren't meant to see. The whispering didn't stop. It just changed tone. Doubt became suspicion. Then confusion. What started as casual slander was beginning to fracture. Because some of them, even the ones who doubted her, were starting to realize the room didn't feel right. The tribunal was too eager. The punishment too public. The accusation too precise. And the moment that tattoo was glimpsed, things stopped adding up. Even the officers looked at each other now, uncertain. A few of them whispered too, not about her, but about the commander's reaction. That twitch in his expression. That recognition. It didn't go unnoticed. They weren't supposed to question it, but they did. Because if the commander knew something they didn't, then maybe she wasn't the one pretending. Maybe they were just never told the truth. Still, the weight of the whispers clung to her, as if they thought their doubts had power, as if their suspicions made her less. But she had walked through far colder rooms than this. Rooms where silence wasn't a weapon, it was a necessity. Where the only whisper you ever heard was the breath before pulling the trigger. And in those rooms, you didn't have time to care what people thought. You only cared about the mission. She reached behind her neck and peeled off the last layer of regulation fabric. It wasn't defiance, it was compliance, sharp and deliberate. They told her to remove the uniform, and she obeyed. Not because she accepted the accusation, but because she had learned long ago that silence was more lethal than defense. Let them believe she had nothing to hide. Let them believe she was cornered. That belief was their first mistake. The white undershirt clung to her back, soaked from the pressure of the moment, from the weight of so many stares attempting to reduce her to less than she was. Her dog tags slid cold against her collarbone as she moved, as if reminding her of the names engraved on her memory more than on metal. Names she never got to bury. Names they would never know. One of the tribunal officers shifted in his seat, clearly agitated that she hadn't responded the way they expected. They were used to desperation, pleading, rage. What they got instead was a soldier standing still in the face of humiliation, staring straight ahead like she had already survived worse. Because she had. They just didn't know it yet. As she turned slightly to pick up the discarded jacket from the floor, dignity intact, even in bare layers, her shirt lifted just enough to reveal the edge of something unusual. It wasn't a regulation mark. It wasn't decoration. It was a tattoo, barely visible, stretching across her upper back and disappearing beneath the fabric again as she straightened. The room didn't gasp. It froze. One of the junior officers blinked, leaned forward, and frowned. Another narrowed his eyes, his posture stiffening as if trying to recall something he wasn't supposed to know. But it was the base commander who reacted first. His fingers stopped tapping the desk. His jaw set, muscles locking in place. For the first time during the entire proceeding, his eyes broke from the tribunal to focus squarely on her. She didn't notice right away. But he did. The lines. The shape. The way the ink had been designed to fold into the body's movements, disappearing with every shift of skin unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. It wasn't a tribal design. It wasn't some personal quote in cursive. It was a symbol. A specific surgical series of codes embedded in ink. A unit insignia, but not one that showed up on any public record. A ghost mark used only once. For an operation that never officially happened. For a team that no longer officially existed. His breathing changed. Not noticeably. Just enough that the people closest to him could tell he had recognized something meant to stay buried. A captain beside him turned, sensing the energy shift. "Sir?" he whispered, unsure whether the commander had seen something critical or merely flinched at the silence. But the commander didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on her back, the tattoo now partially hidden again beneath the cotton fabric. His mind wasn't in the room anymore. It was somewhere else entirely. A decade back, maybe? Or deeper. She adjusted her stance, unaware of the storm building around that glimpse of ink. Or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing. Maybe she had known this moment was coming. Maybe that's why she hadn't resisted when they called her out. Maybe that tattoo wasn't just proof, it was her final card. A few in the room began whispering again, but now it wasn't about forged documents or false honors. Now it was about what they thought they saw. About what it meant. One officer muttered, "I've seen that before. In a briefing room. Years ago. Before we got deployed to, wait, no, never mind." He stopped himself, too aware of what wasn't supposed to be said. Another leaned toward a monitor operator and whispered, "Can you zoom in? That design, why does it look encrypted?" But the monitor remained static. Nothing was recorded here. Nothing official. That was the irony. They had dragged her in to make a public spectacle, yet the one thing that could have saved her wasn't meant to be seen by the public at all. The commander stood. Slowly. The movement was enough to draw everyone's attention, including hers. She turned her head slightly, her expression still unreadable. But her eyes met his, and in that brief glance, an entire past passed silently between them. Recognition. Respect. Regret. The tribunal chair finally noticed the tension and cleared his throat. Unsure whether to proceed. Confused by the commander's sudden shift. "Sir, is there something?" But the commander didn't respond. He walked forward, gaze fixed on her, every step echoing in the now uneasy silence. Because what he saw on her back wasn't just ink. It was a reminder, a mark that carried clearance above anyone else in that room. A mark that meant the uniform wasn't her disguise, it was their oversight. There were only a handful of people alive who could recognize that symbol. Fewer still who were allowed to acknowledge it. It wasn't a regular military tattoo. No unit crest, no date, no sentimental tribute. It was a classified emblem. An encrypted identifier, tattooed only on operatives who had been part of missions so deep in the shadows. Even their debriefings never saw daylight. The kind of missions where bodies disappeared and medals were never minted. And the base commander was one of those few who had once held clearance to approve the ink. He had only seen it once before, years ago, in a sterile room with bulletproof glass and redacted files stacked so high they blocked the sunlight. A black and white photo had been slid across the table. It had shown a body, unrecognizable except for the tattoo that ran across its upper spine, scorched and smeared but still legible to the trained eye. That same mark now peered out from beneath the woman's undershirt. Except this time, the body wasn't cold. It was standing straight, breathing steady, and looking directly at him. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The tribunal could sense the change in him. His presence, once merely supervisory, now loomed like a silent gavel over the entire proceeding. The officers looked to him for confirmation, but his silence said more than 100 objections could. It said someone in this room had made a grave mistake. Still, they didn't fully understand. They didn't know what the mark meant. They thought maybe it was a symbol from a special forces unit. Some secret branch of intelligence. Something vaguely impressive, sure, but not earth-shattering. They didn't know what it actually was. The woman did. It was a promise. A contract made in blood, stitched into the skin not by choice, but by necessity. The kind of mark that overrode protocol, silenced suspicion, and answered only to one chain of command, the kind buried beneath all others. She hadn't wanted it. No one who received it ever did. But those who wore it had earned it in places where rules didn't apply and survival wasn't guaranteed. The tribunal chair fumbled with a paper in front of him. "Lieutenant, this symbol, is it part of your unit's identification?" His voice was tight, attempting composure, unaware of how ridiculous the question sounded to anyone in the know. The woman didn't answer. She merely looked at the commander again, her expression unchanged. He stepped forward without a word and stopped just short of her. She didn't flinch. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had stood on dirt soaked in worse things than fear. The commander reached for the side of her shoulder, then paused, as if asking silent permission. She gave a small nod. He gently lifted the fabric, just enough for the tattoo to come fully into view. A few gasps escaped the back of the room, not because they recognized it, but because the commander's reaction told them it wasn't just any tattoo. His pupils contracted. His throat moved with a swallow he didn't try to hide. For the first time in years, he looked like a man who had just seen something buried rise from the earth again. "She shouldn't be here," he said finally. Not to her, to the room. But no one knew how to respond. He didn't elaborate. He couldn't. Because explaining what that tattoo represented would require opening files that didn't exist, naming locations that had been erased, and confirming operations that could still trigger international fallout if spoken aloud. Another officer leaned in, speaking low to his colleague. "What is it? What does it mean?" The other shook his head. "I don't know, but I've seen that expression before. That's not the look of finding a fraud. That's the look of recognizing a ghost." The tribunal's confidence cracked, just slightly. The woman still stood silently, but her presence now felt entirely different. The uniform she had been ordered to remove lay discarded nearby, but now it was clear. It was never the uniform that validated her. It was the mark beneath it. She hadn't spoken once during the hearing. Not to defend herself. Not to accuse. Because words meant little to people determined not to listen. But that ink spoke louder than anything she could have said. It told a story locked behind classified briefings and top-secret missions. It confirmed her identity not by what she claimed, but by what she had survived. The base commander exhaled, the breath of a man who had just recalled something too heavy to carry and too dangerous to forget. Others in the room tried to piece together what they were witnessing, but the edges wouldn't align. Because this wasn't just a soldier. This was something else entirely. It started slowly. The silence after the commander stepped forward didn't fade like most awkward moments, it deepened. Like a thick fog rolling into the room, it muted voices, stilled fingers, and turned confident expressions into furrowed brows. What had begun as a spectacle, a performance of discipline and removal, was now suspended in confusion. Something unseen had shifted and they didn't know how to respond to it. They only knew something was no longer under their control. The tribunal chair cleared his throat again, but this time his voice didn't carry the same authority. "Commander, if there's something you'd like to add for the record," he began, but the sentence was left dangling in midair, ignored. The base commander's gaze hadn't moved. His eyes were still on the tattoo, still locked on the evidence no one else could interpret. And in that gaze was something unnerving, recognition, yes, but also something heavier. Guilt, maybe? Or awe. For the officers watching, it was unsettling. They had trained under this man, fought beneath his commands. He was the standard. If he looked shaken, if he looked unsure, then something bigger was happening. Something they weren't supposed to know. The woman remained perfectly still, her face expressionless, her back exposed just enough to keep the mark visible. She didn't fidget. She didn't speak. Because she had already said everything with her silence. She had trusted no one in the room to believe her. But she had trusted that the tattoo would speak in a language they couldn't ignore. And now it had. The junior officers leaned back in their chairs, uncertain whether they were still part of a disciplinary hearing or something else entirely. One of them, Lieutenant Moore, leaned over to another and whispered, "Why does this feel like a mistake we weren't supposed to witness?" The other didn't reply. He was too busy watching the base commander, whose stance had shifted into something unfamiliar, something almost reverent. Finally, the commander turned to the room. His voice, when it came, was quiet but unshakable. "Who authorized this tribunal?" The chair straightened in his seat, caught off guard by the question. "Sir, we followed standard protocol." Suspicion was raised by the audit team in Logistics Command. They flagged inconsistencies in her assignment history, missing mission logs, unexplained clearances they weren't missing. The commander cut in, not loudly but with finality. They were classified. Buried so deep only 3 names were allowed to access them. Mine was one of them. The weight of his words landed hard. A few of the officers exchanged glances. Others stopped pretending to take notes. The hearing had veered off script and now they were just trying to keep up. The woman hadn't moved, but she no longer felt like the one being judged. The room's focus had shifted without ceremony. Now, they weren't asking what she had done, they were wondering what they had just uncovered. The tribunal chair looked like he wanted to push back, but thought better of it. He fumbled with the papers in front of him, then finally asked, "Are you saying this operative, this soldier, is above our authority?" The commander didn't answer immediately. He looked back at the tattoo as if searching it for something he had forgotten. Then finally he said, "I'm saying she was trained under parameters none of you have clearance to discuss. Her record wasn't incomplete. It was protected. For national security reasons. She's not just a soldier. She's a classified asset." The term hung in the air like a blade suspended mid-fall. A classified asset. That wasn't a phrase tossed around lightly. It meant everything they thought they knew about her, every training module, every mission, every award, had been filtered through layers of misdirection, redaction, and intentional obfuscation. It meant that they hadn't just failed to understand her past. They were never meant to see it in the first place. The whispering started again, but now it carried a different tone. No longer judgment. No longer speculation. Now it was fear. Unease. A slow, dawning realization that they might have just tried to publicly humiliate someone who operated on a level so far above them they couldn't even measure the distance. Even the guards standing at her side adjusted their stance. They hadn't spoken the entire time, but their posture shifted from oversight to uncertainty. The woman hadn't changed her expression once, and yet the entire room had changed around her. The same people who once looked at her with contempt now avoided her gaze altogether. They had called her a fraud, a liar, a disgrace to the uniform. But the truth had revealed itself not in her words but in a symbol she had never needed to explain. Because real operatives don't explain. They endure. They wait. And when the time comes, they let the silence do the talking. She didn't move when the base commander spoke those words. She's a classified asset. The room had already gone still, but now it felt like something had cracked open beneath them, an invisible line crossed, a protocol shattered. No one breathed the same after that. Some looked away out of embarrassment. Others stared harder, trying to piece together how they had misjudged her so profoundly. They'd stripped her of rank, questioned her legitimacy, doubted her identity. And now they were learning she outranked them in ways they couldn't even define. She stood in nothing more than her undershirt and regulation pants. The uniform they tried to take from her lying like discarded fabric on the cold tribunal floor. But in that moment, she no longer needed it. They had demanded she prove herself, forced her into a corner where her silence would be interpreted as guilt. Yet the proof was never in her voice. It was in her presence, her calm, her restraint. Now it was in the commander's eyes. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His words had already traveled the length of the room like a quiet detonation, dismantling every accusation with precision. A few officers began whispering furiously, some flipping through case files and digital logs, looking for anything that could have told them who she really was. But there was nothing. Her past was a black hole. Redacted files, missing timestamps, ghost entries in mission archives with only initials and blurred locations. She wasn't a ghost, they realized she was the reason ghosts existed. Someone in the third row finally stood. A major with 2 tours under his belt and a history of rarely backing down. Sir, with respect, if she's classified, if she's that level of clearance, then how were we even allowed to initiate this hearing? The question made sense, and yet it felt dangerous. The commander turned toward him, slow and sharp. You weren't, he replied. The silence that followed wasn't the same as before. This time it was humiliation disguised as confusion. The entire proceeding had been a mistake, a breach of protocol so severe it bordered on treason. Not against her, but against the very system that had protected her identity. Someone had dug too deep. And worse, they had gone public with it. She remained still. Her silence was no longer mistaken for fear or shame. Now it was terrifying. Because it wasn't silence anymore, it was control. She had known this might happen. That one day someone would try to unmask her in the name of ego or envy. That someone would decide she didn't look the part. And when they did, she wouldn't fight. She would let the truth rise on its own. A young analyst in the back looked up from his tablet, visibly shaken. He turned the screen toward his superior, whispering, "There's a symbol match from a secure ops briefing 4 years ago. Operation Crimson Halo. I thought that was fiction." The superior took one look at the symbol, the same one now revealed on her back, and shut the screen instantly. "Don't say another word," he muttered. Across the room, eyes that had once mocked her were now avoiding her completely. The same people who had once snickered at her speed during drills, who questioned how she passed advanced weapons training without fail, now tried to remember every moment they might have spoken her name aloud. Not with admiration, but with arrogance. She finally bent down, picked up her jacket and held it. Not with shame, but almost like a relic. The uniform had been used to define her, then strip her, but it was no longer necessary. Because now they saw something else. Not the uniform, not even the tattoo. They saw what it meant to live above the line. To be part of a program so buried, even high-ranking officers pretended it didn't exist. No one dared stop her. Not even the tribunal chair, whose authority had crumbled somewhere between the accusation and the commander's revelation. He looked like a man trying to count backwards from a mistake that couldn't be undone. The base commander stepped aside, just slightly, giving her a clear path forward. A gesture, a signal, one professional to another. She passed him without words, and he didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He knew what she was, what she had done, and what she had survived. Those in the room would never speak of this again. Not in reports, not in casual conversation. The ones who witnessed it would carry it like a scar they never earned, an encounter with someone who was never supposed to be seen, much less questioned.